Modine. Well, let's go ahead. I'll let everybody introduce themselves. Go ahead. Start with you, Mo.
I'm with Geffard Farm Management.
Mark Raywall. Mike Nordstrom, Van Dolan. Steve Jackson with Tri-County.
Indiana Jackson.
Melissa Brandon with Tri-County.
Great, and I'll have Melissa call each individual with their first name, and you can introduce yourself and let us know who you're representing today.
Alan Becker.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
We
hi,
can,
Alan.
yes.
I'm here in this meeting, and I'm with Renewable Resources Group.
Great, thank you.
Renewable.
Do you want me to call Mayor?
He's with you.
Well, yes.
Mayor Hussein.
Yeah, I'm Mayor Hussein. I'm with Geosyntec. We're the consultants for Tri-County.
Anderson.
Bob Anderson, Senior Principal with Geosyntec.
Hi, Bob.
Carol Combs, Executive Director, Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership.
Hi, Carol.
Josh Vanden Heuvel.
That's Jeff Vanden Heuvel, and I'm with Milk Producers Council.
Kathy Wood McLaughlin.
Hi, this is Kathy Wood McLaughlin, and I'm representing the Bureau of Land Management and also the Lower Deer Creek Watershed Planning.
Did you get a haircut?
No, I pulled my hair back. It's all the zooming.
Now you know you're going offline.
Yeah. That was Mark. Thanks, Mark.
Timothy Keldson.
Yeah, Tim Keltson, Atwell Island, BLM.
Hi, Tim.
And then Megan Chacon.
Megan Shequin representing John Hancock.
And then Ryan Stacy.
Ryan Stacy, External Affairs Intern.
And Stacy Ann.
Stacy Ann Silva, New Current Water and Land.
And that seems to be everyone.
We have some phone numbers.
Or one of them is us.
Yeah.
And I can't see
Is there anybody else we missed that's online with us? Or join us by
Yeah.
phone?
Molly Thurman with John Hancock.
Hi, Molly.
Hi.
And just to make it a party, Carl Evers with Hancock.
Hi, Carl.
Carl. How you been? This is Raywall. You doing any farming?
Hi, Mark. No farming anymore.
How's your dad?
Dad's good. No farming for him either, though.
All right, great. Well, Mary, are you ready to get started?
I am. That's let's go ahead and get started. We got a lot to cover today. I'm sure most of you want to get. I'm gonna take a few minutes. You should have all received the agenda, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I've been having some computer issues, as I was telling Deanna earlier this morning. So if my transitions to the different items or presentations are a little bit slow this morning, please just bear with me. I thought I had everything worked out and uploaded all these new drivers or downloaded all these new drivers and everything, and made the problem worse. So the miracle of modern technology. So having said all that, let me jump into a few updates for you. The agenda, the first item on the agenda, of course, is the Sigma updates. We're going to talk about some updates to what's happening in the Tule Subbasin, Land IQ, and then Kathy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the Lower Deer Creek Watershed Plan. The Tule Subbasin, there's been a number of meetings with the management group for Tule Subbasin. And the one that I did want to bring to this group's attention is that there is an update to the model that is occurring right now. And as part of that update to the model, and specifically how it affects the southeast area, they're essentially asking us about how much we think consumptive use is going to increase in the southeast area over the next 20 years. Part of that, and I think a big part of that increase is what they're seeing on the Cal Poly surveys that were done, the remote sensing surveys that were done, and they are seeing that values that right now that are much lower than what we're anticipating those to be. And so that's probably based on the fact that some of the trees are shown as being quote unquote immature at this point. And so they have a increase in consumptive use continuing on, and that's an ongoing discussion that we're going to have with them. Some of that, of course, is going to be affected by the conversation we're going to have in a little bit about the proposed allocation methodology. But maybe
It's Mike, let me just interrupt you. Is that just based on the existing trees that are planted? Or is that also for additional crop shifts or additional plantings that may take place?
No, for right now, Mike, all they're using is an average from 2009 to 2018, and it's based on cropping patterns from 2018. So part of the question is,
Yeah, no, I know they'll go up for based on what's been planted, but is there other lands that may be planted or shifted from a row crop to tree crop that need to be looked at as well, or? I don't think so. I mean,
They're asking for our best estimate for the next 20 years, but you know, and some of those things are unknown right now. So.
I'm just sorry to interrupt there, Mayor.
No, it's quite all right. Please ask as many questions. This is, as Deanna, if you heard Deanna, she's right. This is our best estimate at this time, and we all know that these numbers are going to change as we start getting into it and as we start collecting. Deanna and I were talking earlier, as I mentioned, and we kind of wish that they had given us a little bit more time to come up with some of these and have some more discussions with some of the stakeholders on this call. But for this iteration of the model, which is is going to continue to evolve and change, we're gonna at least take a look at that and see what our best guess is at this time. We're essentially going to say that no more land is going to go into production, and the land that's currently in production is going to mature and go through a natural cycle for those trees or crops. But we're going to essentially hold the land use pattern as it stands today, because that's our best information that we have available to us at this moment. I wish we had more time, and I wish we had the ability to have some more conversations with each of you. But unfortunately, through a series of events, they've only given us a week to kind of come up with these values, and we're going to have to make some gross estimates. Any questions or concerns from any of the stakeholders? Does that seem like a reasonable approach at where we sit now?
Is this harder updating the model, or is it?
Correct. Yeah, this would be Thomas Harder's model that they're updating for the entire subbasin. They are really trying to work out calibrations for subsidence. But yeah, it's one of we've talked about this before. We're giving information, data that, it's our best data at this time, and, we're going to do this update. I'm certain there'll be another update or two throughout the year because the data is getting better, but we'll just give what we have at this time, and then as we have to refine that data and put that in the model.
Are they running it for the Bryant issue on the east side, or is it just basin-wide as looking at this?
It's a basin-wide update, but in on the Kern Canal because they're really trying to work out how they're going to stem the subsidence over there. And the white area in the in the Eastern Thule Groundwater Sustainability Agency hired a company called Aqualogics that is also preparing subsidence studies. And so they're really working on their zone of compliance for the Bryant right now, I think is the best way to say it. But the update's a basin-wide update. It'll be used to direct our actions in the future. I don't know if there's enough data to really use it to direct our actions out here in the West currently, but we'll give it our best effort.
And this won't be the last update to the model. Trust me, there'll be plenty more, and we'll have a chance to continue to refine these numbers. But I wanted to make sure that everybody on the call, at least for the stakeholders, were aware of what we're going to put in there. And if you have concerns, and if you want to talk offline, please go ahead and contact Deanna. Okay, the Land IQ update. Land IQ is currently been providing updates each on a monthly basis for the consumptive use. They are, and that's literally what we're getting. We're getting a land use from 2018. They plan to update that to a 2019 land use and cropping patterns, but we are getting monthly consumptive use values now for Tri-County. We have not at this point determined exactly how we're going to turn consumptive use into a groundwater extraction. There's some ongoing conversations about whether we were going to use a Four Creek system, and we're having some ongoing discussions with Four Creeks if we're going to use their system or if we're going to do that calculation internal to Tri-County. So exactly how we end up using the land IQ data in the future, that's still being discussed right now, and we'll bring this group up to speed on when some of those decisions are made. I'm going to pause again and just see if anyone has any questions. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned earlier, and I apologize for this, is I did hit the record button. As most of you know that have been on these calls, we do record these calls, and we will be posting them and uploading them. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that they're being recorded. Moving on, the Lower Deer Creek Watershed Plan. Kathy, any updates for the group?
Sure. We had our public meeting in July. I think one person actually came in person. We're looking at having the plan, which I think most of you understand that we're looking at land retirement. We're not calling it that, but conversion of lands that are coming out of production. Pixley ID has estimated maybe 20,000 acres. I know you're not talking about it in Tri-County. And also 3 wildlife-friendly recharge basins that are going to be along the Deer Creek. The big piece that's come up recently is at the urging of Carol Combs. Thanks, Carol. The Pixley ID on behalf of the Thule Subbasin is applying for the Department of Conservation's, it's a mouthful, Sustainable Groundwater Management Watershed Coordinator Program. Provides up to $300,000 for a watershed coordinator that'll work in our subbasin. And some of the things they'll be helping out with is not only the Lower Deer Creek Watershed Plan implementation, which will be receiving, once it's approved, funding from the USDA, but also we'll be working with landowners on identifying properties coming out of production. So we're asking each GSA if they are interested, willing to participate. We're looking for a cooperator letter that just says, hey, we're in favor of this and we'd like to get some feedback. I'll share with Deanna our proposal and get some feedback from you all on how this would benefit. The big benefit I see, and as most of you know, I was the watershed coordinator under the Tulare Basin Watershed Initiative with Carol, is we can infuse a lot and help a lot with grant writing. And we're looking at funding from USDA, funding from the Bureau of Reclamation. We've brought in 3 major grants with upland habitat restoration and habitat work with the Bureau. And we're also going to utilize land retirement strategies from the Bureau of Land Management. So it's an opportunity to infuse some money and help us meet some of our groundwater sustainability goals that are in our groundwater sustainability plans.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Any questions for Kathy?
And last thing, we will be looking for a watershed coordinator. We're not going to name, I'm going to help mentor that person since I worked here. But if anybody's interested, it'll be a part-time position working in the Tule subbasin, particularly in this area of Tri-County, Pixley, and Lower Tule.
Okay. All right, great. Well, let's move on then. I want to get in. Oh, question?
Mark asked, what does it pay?
Oh, what does it pay?
Mark wants the job. Minimum wage is going up next year, Mark. With that tax increase.
Yeah, I think right now we're looking at somewhere in the $75 to $100 an hour for a consultant, and we may be able to supplement that with funding from other organizations that'll partner with us. But again, we'll be negotiating that after we get the grant, which we're keeping our fingers crossed. I think we have a really good chance. But it'll be probably hiring somebody in the consultant capacity rather than hiring somebody directly with Pixley or with the Land Trust.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Kathy.
Kathy, what are you looking for in that cooperative letter?
I have a sample.
Okay.
Is that Mark?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll send that to you because I actually call out, I used Tri-County, and I actually call out some of your projects that we've actually put into the work plan, including your wetland reserve areas and the AAA project with Allensworth. Big piece of this is working with disadvantaged communities. And I think that the watershed coordinator can help with that piece, since I know you're all very busy with looking at allocations and groundwater sustainability. I think this piece will help with the local communities.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Kathy before we move on? Okay. Getting into the implementation part of the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the meter policy and then the allocation study, the initial draft straw man that we've sent out. And I'm sure that's what the vast majority of you are on this call to hear. And then we're going to end with some discussion on potential projects to bring in some surface water to the southeast area. So let me start with the easy one first. The meter policy. We are going to go ahead and finalize that document. We're going to take it to the board next week for their approval. If anyone has any last minute questions or comments, you have until Friday. We're going to finalize that document and take it up to the board.
Mayor, this is Molly Thurman with John Hancock. I do have
Yes.
a few questions. Is it okay to ask them now rather than sending them in writing?
Sure.
Okay. In the draft policy, there is mention that the information will be aggregated such that it protects landowner information, but it doesn't really specify anything about the aggregation of data. And so I was just curious, is that going to be on, a GSA level, or do you guys have any idea of what that aggregation is going to look like?
We would like to aggregate it to a GSA level for public submittal. So the idea being, the amount of pumping, groundwater pumping occurring in the southeast area is value X, and the value and the groundwater pumping occurring in the north areas is so essentially to the sub areas of the GSA. We'd like to aggregate it to that and say that that's sufficient for any public release of this documentation. As far as DWR is concerned, it's just going to be one number for the entire GSA.
Okay. The other question I had is there, under the fees section, there's some language about not charging landowners for field visits. And so, but there's no other mention of field visits. Is that something you guys are planning on having?
No, we'll take, I'm glad you said that. That's a remnant, and we will take that out. We're not planning any field visits at this time.
Okay, perfect. That eliminates one of my other questions. And then the last question I had about the government code cited that basically provides protection to individual landowner information. Mm-hmm. Is there a confidentiality agreement that's needed between the landowners and the GSA to make that government code go into full effect? There's language in there. Oh, I was going to say there's language in there that if it's obtained in confidence, then it would be subject to the confidentiality statute. And so I wasn't sure if there's some sort of agreement that's needed to really substantiate that.
You know what?
I'm sorry, Mayor. This is Deanna. That government code was specifically given to us by legal counsel, and she did not indicate that we needed to have a confidentiality agreement. But I will check with her before the board meeting to clarify that.
Yeah.
I would recommend that their counsel give it your counsel and draft something, because if they do it, it is confidential. If it gets to you, it's not confidential. Attorney to attorney does it, it's confidential. I talked to him.
Yeah,
I guess that's a good point.
I think that's a good point, Molly.
Okay, and I was going to say, Mark, that your point was good too. I don't know if the information needs to be submitted by attorneys so that there's attorney-client privileges, or if that even takes effect. I'm not sure.
I would absolutely have your counsel talk to the counsel for the GSA.
Okay. And I'm not sure if there are other landowners that are smaller or that don't want to pay attorney fees for, submitting data, but I'm not sure if that confidentiality agreement would substantiate or work.
Right. Yeah, I'll check, and if there are any, if she thinks that is necessary or advisable, then I'll make sure to get her in contact with any growers' attorneys that want to do it at that level, or we'll just have something drafted up that growers can sign.
Yeah, that would be great. I appreciate it. A couple other questions, just I guess these are more aerial about the metering policy. My understanding is that the intent is really to track the change in groundwater conditions, but I guess I should first ask, is that correct? That's my understanding, is that correct?
You have to know what the use is, what you're told.
Yeah, Mark's right.
Okay, I wasn't sure, is it intended to be used for like fee collection for the groundwater extraction fees? I know that we have the ET policy in place for the groundwater extraction fees, but we may end up with two conflicting sources of data, and so I wasn't sure what role each program or policy will play.
Yeah, but I would think, Molly, that your meter data would substantiate anything that at a later date, since I missed the land IQ deal, to substantiate what you think your actual water use is compared to what you could be potentially billed for.
Yeah, so that makes perfect sense to me, but.
Okay, you'd be very interested in that component, and then the GSA is interested in, are we in line with how we're going to balance out the entire GSA?
All right. And so we have always had, a lot of data gathering for our ranches to be sure that we're operating as sustainably as possible. One of the questions is with this meter data and the metering policy now, is there going to be any sort of reconciliation process for meter data versus ET data as far as the groundwater extraction fees go?
Want to answer that for the patient?
Yeah, Molly, so this issue is pretty complex, and because the Land IQ data is so new and we haven't had an opportunity to really digest that information and view it, we haven't received everybody's metered information yet because we haven't enforced the meter policy yet. So there's no way for us at this point to make any kind of evaluation on how that is lining up and if we need to change direction and use one over the other. So that's really still to be determined, is what I would say.
For the basin, though.
Oh, for the basin.
I mean, this is being used by the basin, though.
So the basin.
Land IQ is a common language that we're talking, so I think that's the direction, Molly, why we went this way. Because the Tule Basin is looking at the extraction on ET basis.
And I had a discussion with David DeGroot yesterday, who most of you know is the facilitator for the basin, and he said pretty much the rest of the basin is going to use consumptive use. That is what they're going to use. So in order to be in line with what the basin is doing, we definitely want to take a hard look at Land IQ's data and see if we can use the same values that the rest of the sub-basin is using.
Deanna, if I may, I think Molly's question was more towards the, yes, we are using ET and that's the accepted law of the land as you have just outlined. But because there is a meter policy in Tri-County and you're requiring metering in Tri-County, is there going to be a policy established to where if a landowner does have serious issue with their Land IQ data, they could come forward because they have meter data that's been qualified by the GSA and there be an established dispute resolution process for that? So not trumping the ET data, but rather just having some sort of a backstop policy in place in case there's a discrepancy.
Yes, I definitely see that, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have meter data. We want to make certain that we're using the best values possible, and if a landowner can substantiate that their actual meter data is different than the Land IQ data, then we would use that data. That said, you're right, there will be a process to substantiate that claim, and at that point, we wouldn't be asking for aggregated numbers. We would be asking for actual meter data.
There's going to be a number of policies that are going to, as we get into full Sigma implementation, as everyone on this call is well aware, we're going to have to write a few more policies. The meter policy was the one we started with because we really do need that data point of how much groundwater is actually being extracted across the sub-basin. Bob's going to start into the allocation straw man here in just a little bit. But I think one of the things you'll see as you go through the straw man is, and if those of you that have read the document, there's some conflicting information out there as to exactly what that extraction number is. And so in order to help us start to, really make this allocation method work, we really need to get a better handle on exactly how much. But Molly, I think Deanna and Steve addressed your question, though. There is going to have to be a reconciliation policy in place, or methodology, or statement, or whatever you want to call it, process for this to occur. But that's something we're going to have to work out as we over the next few years as we start to get some of this data in. Did that kind of answer your question?
It did.
Okay. All right. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to rush you. I just want to make sure that we have sufficient time, because I know that the straw man is probably the one thing that everybody really wants to hear and talk about some more. So I'm gonna move on, and Bob has a presentation where he's kind of taken some of the key items from the document, the draft document that we sent out on the straw man policy, and or I shouldn't call it a policy, or the straw man report that we put together. And he's going to go through that. I want to encourage everybody, though, to ask as many questions as you possibly can. This is not the only time we're going to discuss this. This is the initial draft. We wanted to get something out there for everybody to kind of look at. We know that there's a whole lot of variables in the document that we wrote. We know there's a lot of variables that we didn't cover every single aspect. Jeff's on the call, and I know he's going to ask me about how would this policy affect the dairies, and so there are some items that we are well aware that we didn't get down to the nitty-gritty details of every possibility of water use out there, but we think we've addressed some of the key and major issues, and we think we're at a point now where we felt like this document was sufficient to get out to the group and start the dialogue and really start having some more robust discussion with this group. Deanna, did you want to add anything before I turn it over to Bob?
No, I would just, I thank you, Bob, for working on this, and what Amir said is true. We're going to work through this. This is not in any means a final document. It's the beginning of a conversation, and we look forward to hearing everybody's comments.
Bob, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Can you see my screen?
We can, yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been noodling this for a while, so we've thought about a lot of different things. And what we've put together now is sort of our current state of thinking. So as Amir said, things will evolve. We're trying to get you to a point where, ultimately our goal is to develop some sort of an initial allocation formula that can be applied to each parcel in Tri-County that's eligible for the allocation. And to do that, there are a number of issues that we have to consider. Some of them are what I would call really foundational and can be addressed now. And some of them are more complex and nuanced, and either can be addressed later or they need to be addressed later because we don't have the information or the time. So what we're really trying to do is come up with a recommendation that can get you down the road. It sort of revolves around the idea of a landowner registry and an interim allocation formula based on some of these foundational definitions of water types that are considered in the allocation. And then as you move down the road and start thinking about these other factors and how you want to incorporate those, we can do that at a later time. So what I've put together to sort of a cheat sheet for you, it's not a very exciting report in terms of graphics. It's basically all words. And the slides that I'm going to show you here are basically kind of bullet points on each of the sections in the report so that you get sort of the take-home message on each of these sections. But I encourage you to, read through it, and there are probably, I'm sure there are things that we could have said differently, that we could have said better. I'm pretty sure we haven't clarified everything in this report. So this is a starting point, and I would sort of think of it as kind of a mutual document that we're trying to put together here so that everybody here feels comfortable with how we're trying to explain things, how we're trying to address things, and we can adjust and move forward. Ultimately, the board's going to need to make some recommendations and decisions, and we sort of outlined those at the end. But how I think this group has some responsibility on how we frame that up for the board. So again, there's an introduction that talks about the basic foundational components of the allocation. There's a series of other factors that we discuss And we have a kind of an initial straw man on how we think you could move forward and start down the road of allocation, perhaps by the end of the year. Hopefully by the end of the year, I guess. So let's see, advance the slides here. So the first question is, what's the sustainable yield? It's referenced in different forms in different documents. What we ended up doing was just going back to the coordination agreement, which says there's a plausible range of between 0.227 and 0.34, and each GSA is supposed to figure out their allowable pumping by multiplication. So we've suggested that you go with the upper plausible range because we know this sustainable yield is going to change as the model changes and other assumptions in the model change. So for the time being, there's nothing that prevents you from picking the upper plausible range. So for right now, we're thinking 21,000 should be your number for the sustainable yield. That's the 2040 yield. For the transitional pumping, you have to start somewhere. There are two parts to the transitional pumping. There's where you start, and there's the ramp down, the rate at which you reduce that pumping. Again, we picked a number, and we think that, again, lacking other information, 90,000 acre feet as a current pumping estimate is generous and defensible at this point. It's consistent with what was reported in the annual report. It's consistent with a separate analysis that I did based on Cropscape, which is USDA's satellite imagery, which I've used for a number of years, so I'm comfortable with it and kind of know where its glitches are and how to interpret it, along with ITRC-ET. But that number is different than both the recent land cover that's done by Land IQ. It's different than the number that's in the subbasin groundwater model, and it's really different than what's in your GSP, although the method that you used in your GSP is much more similar to what I did than what's being done by Land IQ or the model. So the idea is pick this number for now, and then as we implement metering, actual pumping in future years can be refined, and the transitional amounts can sort of be calibrated to what we know the actual use is at any point in time.
Is it possible to ask a question at this point?
Why don't you let me get through the first half of it before we get to the other factors?
Okay,
And,
it was just a fact question. The 90,000, is that math that you got to 90 so much per acre foot per times so many acres, or was it?
Right.
Well,
so that takes Cropscape classification of the ground, whether it's pistachios or almonds, wheat or pasture, and then it applies the irrigation requirement based on ITRC Zone 15 tables. So it multiplies those two, calculates the water demand, aggregates it all, and subtracts out some surface water imports. And again, knowing that, when you use Cropscape, you get a few acres of plums and oranges and weird stuff. And so I sort of aggregated all those into a bucket that was permanent crops, mostly trees and grapes, and seasonal or annual crops, which is your grain and hay and alfalfa and that sort of thing.
Well, there's just a big difference between geocentric number 1 and geocentric number 2, the Land IQ, in terms of acres in production.
Right, exactly, and that's
so
one of the
I was
things
just asking about that, but I'm sorry for interrupting.
That's okay. Well, that's a question we have too. The number of acres in production don't add up to what we see in Cropscape for 2019.
Yeah, I had a similar question on page 4, that second bullet, where you said the Tri-County GSP current pumping is estimated to 79,800. It's based on the estimated 29,000 acres of irrigated lands from Tulare County. But Ann we're pumping, on top of that we're irrigating lands outside of Tulare County.
Right. So this only applies to, well, that's the number that's in your GSP. So again, we're just trying to pick your starting point right now. If this committee would prefer that we pick a lower number, we could pick a lower number. But I think that, again, I think this just points to the uncertainty, and this is also why we're sort of landing on this idea of a landowner registry where we have, parcel by parcel confirmation by the landowner on the information that's in there, and we're not trying to do, satellite black helicopter interpretation of what we think is actually going on there. We want every landowner to sort of see what the allocation formula is, what information on their properties went into that formula, and if they don't agree with it, then they should have the opportunity to adjust it and recalculate their formula based on whatever information they can provide us.
Bob, can I interrupt just for a second? One of the big questions, and I think this gets into some of what we're discussing, is exactly what area we're going to be looking at for this initial discussion on allocation, and we've settled on just the Tule side of Tulare, of the Tri-County, excuse me, and we're going to have to do something very similar for Tulare Lake, but that's going to be a discussion and trying to figure out what the allocation for the Tulare Lake side. So for right now, the decision that was made, with Deanna, was to focus just on the Tule side of this. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through. And I think, Mike, that might get to your question about some of the land that's in production elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a good point, Amir. All right, ramp down is pretty simple. We've just said, let's go with what's consistent with your GSP and the coordination agreement and assume a linear ramp down to 2035. So that pretty much defines your initial shape. If we want to look at a nonlinear ramp down, we can consider that later based on other factors as we work through them. But this sort of sets the course, at least for the first few years. For surface water imports, again, we just point out that when you bring in surface water, it could factor into the allocation of groundwater pumping. It could also be handled in the water market, and so we talk about that in the water market as well. There are sort of two components, two ways surface water can influence the allocation or the market. It's either a direct replacement, which is easy, but really depends on whether you're able to develop projects that extend infrastructure to groundwater only areas. But certainly that should result in a one-to-one reduction in pumping. And then the flip side of that is infiltration as recharge, which gets a little more complex, and we've gone through some of the complexities. So you understand, it's a combination of seepage from the canals that bring it to a basin, if that's where it's being infiltrated. It involves any evaporation that might occur in the basin. It involves soil moisture and ET on the ground if anything's done on farm. For now, we're not incorporating surface water into the allocation, but obviously we know that surface water is crucial to reducing the impact of the sustainable yield on the ag footprint. We also have tried to explain a concept related to the time. There's a time factor to all of this that really isn't accounted for in the basin definition of sustainable yield, but we think you should be considering these time factors that acknowledge when infiltration actually becomes groundwater, and then also consider some sort of a carryover that acknowledges that at some point that infiltrated surface water becomes completely commingled with native groundwater and really is becoming a single groundwater volume that's kind of moved off stream. And that concept becomes more important when you have really episodic infiltration events, which you're likely to have if you're targeting flood flows. Because one big spike is a little different than, multiple year over year infiltration events. So again, we haven't incorporated it into what we think your initial formula should be, but this factor is something to be thinking about as well. So those are the foundational elements of the allocation formulas. The other factors we've kind of just gone through and outlined what the issues are and what we know or don't know, so that going forward we can decide which of these factors we want to prioritize, which do we want to address first, do we want to combine some things, that sort of thing. So this section is really just these sections are more of a primer on what the issues are with these other factors. So when we talk about upper and lower aquifer, all of these GSPs in this area talk about upper, lower aquifer, but none of the GSPs, including this one, estimate the sustainable yield for each aquifer. So that really limits us in the ability to initiate any allocation formula that splits the total allocation into upper and lower. The idea of managing the upper and lower aquifer differently is great. It's good. It makes sense. It's relevant to subsidence and all of that. And, having separate pumping targets for each of those aquifers should be considered. But until we have a method to determine what the upper and lower should be, we really can't go down that road yet. Your GSP in particular, I think, has a lot of good information on upper and lower. So I think when we get to the point of this landowner registry, it will be relatively simple to preload what we think we know and have landowners confirm, yes, I do have a shallow well, or yes or no, I don't. But ultimately, we're going to need to have some record that attributes an individual landowner to whether they have shallow or deep wells, and some understanding of what that distribution is. We've talked about land status before in terms of, is it agricultural, is it federal wetlands, is it producing land, is it non-producing land? All those sorts of things are important not only for the sustainable yield, but also for the transitional allocation, because theoretically, part of the idea of the transitional allocation was to make sure that existing uses are gradually ramped down as necessary based on your plan. So we have some reasonable estimates at the GSA scale, but we still need to get this down into a parcel by parcel format to manage the allocation. And so this is related to this whole idea of a landowner registry. But once we get to that level of detail, then we can have a real estimate of what an individual dairy landowner, for example, is using. And so we want to make sure we're at least understanding whether we're under or over allocating associated lands, especially for the transitional pumping. And then, of course, we'll talk about this in the landowner registry, that a lot of the federal lands and the wildlife refuges aren't even in our database for the Prop 218 election. So we still have a number of acres of unclassified lands that we need to get into the registry if we want to make them eligible for an allocation. Water rights is a very light touch on concepts, mostly related to this idea of correlative reduction and historic beneficial use. So it just sort of outlines how this idea of correlative reduction reduces everybody's historic water use in proportion to the sustainable yield. When it comes to disputes or assertions about water rights, including the priority of water rights, the place of use of those water rights, our recommendation at this point is that you really have no choice but to exclude it. Specific water right resolutions really have to be excluded from the allocation plan because the GSA has no authority to resolve that. If any landowner would like to pursue a water rights resolution, we think the best way to do that is separate from the GSA. And the allocation plan is sort of, at least as we've initially structured it, it's about place of use. Lands that are receiving water within Tri-County are the lands that the GSA is responsible for managing in terms of groundwater. And some of these other issues about where it's used and when that priority was established really need to be resolved outside. We will talk about the idea, though, of determining historic use and incorporating, say, the date that water was put to beneficial use can be incorporated into the allocation. But it would not be sort of a legally binding resolution of that water right. Boundary flows are another thing that are going to come up. It's still kind of a wild card, both for the Tule Basin yield calculation, and there may be separate basin to basin or GSA to GSA agreements on, what sort of groundwater levels and flows do we want to try and maintain along these boundaries. That could either change the total sustainable yield of the basin, depending on what the next iteration of the model is. If the boundary conditions change, the sustainable yield could change. And then within an individual GSA, there may be some adjustments or factors to consider if you're pumping closer to the boundary as opposed to farther away from the boundary. So really, this is still a wild card, and we need some better resolution of the issue. I mean, we still have some discrepancies on groundwater flow directions at these boundaries. So really, more information is necessary before we can resolve this one. Forecasting, there's a section on forecasting because really managing and enforcing an individual landowner allocation from year to year requires some element of forward-looking and backward-looking assessments of water use and any associated responses in groundwater levels. And so you can take an approach that's very much an average sort of forced march, same allocation year after year after year. And, if you're above it, you get strict enforcement. If you're below it, I don't know. Or you could take more of an adaptive management approach where the GSA makes some yearly adjustments to the allocation. You set an allocation target. This is what we think we're shooting for here over the next period of time. But based on the year type and and the trends or observations of previous years, you can make some adjustments from year to year, and Sigma allows you to do that. But it's a little more refined way to recognize the variability that you're going to see both in the amount of water that's coming in and the demand in your current land use situation. So that section is out there to give you some thinking points on how, I'll say complex, but how refined you want to make your year-to-year allocation decisions. And then we also have a section on the water market. I know people have been talking about the water market. we all know what the objective is. I think an important thing to remember is that this is a very water short basin. So any lands that receive an allocation, we really need them to participate in the market so that we don't strand any water anywhere. So, you've got, I don't know, 200 plus different landowners in the basin, which is a relatively small number, and they own parcels ranging from 5 to 7,000 acres. So, especially for those smaller sized parcels, if they're granted an allocation, we want to make sure that we can get that allocation moving through the market. If the idea is to move that water because they don't use it to other landowners that will buy it because they need it. We'll also talk a little bit about the surface water recharge component of this, which is really a crediting component, and it's actually, relatively speaking, it's fairly simple to incorporate. It's kind of a new source that can be accounted for differently, but within the same groundwater market. And I think that's probably going to be probably the most important part of your water market and the associated fallowed lands that might become infiltration facilities, how you deal with the ownership of that infiltration and availability to the market. So we think the first step, now we're getting towards your recommendations. So we've got all these things that we've identified and are really difficult for us to resolve right now. But we can resolve some of those and get down the road on a lot of these issues by getting what I would call a formal landowner registry established, so that we're really looking at this from the perspective of individual parcels and landowners, and not always looking at it from this, we've got 61,000 acres of Tri-County Water Authority, and how do we divvy it up? Ultimately, this has to end up as a ground up, bottom up system that you can issue a landowner their allocation. They know how they got it. They know what information went into it. And they therefore know what they have and are comfortable and in agreement with the decision there. So what we have now in our database is just based on the Prop 218 election. As I mentioned, we have a certain number of acres, but there are still about 11,000 unregistered acres, so we don't know whether they should be eligible for the allocation. I think a lot of those acres are probably federal acres, wetlands or whatnot, but we need to get those uploaded and identified. And once we have all the parcels registered, then we can start adding columns. Think of it as a big spreadsheet. You're going to add columns about what the status of the land is. Is it permanent crop, seasonal crop, dairy, wetland, etc.? How is it irrigated? Are there wells in the upper or lower aquifer? What's your historic water use? A lot of these issues related to those other factors, we can start to build into the registry. So in order to get that registry working, obviously confidentiality is important. We talked about that earlier today. And again, ultimately, I think we don't want this to be a bird's eye view of everything. We want individual landowners to see what is in the database on their properties and confirm that that it's acceptable to them. And as you develop your processes, there could be opt-in or opt-out clauses where if we don't hear from you, this is the number we're going to put in there, that sort of thing. But we really, I think, need to make sure that we're treating each landowner, whether they have 5 acres or 2,000 acres, that we're treating them equally.
Yeah, sure.
Can I ask everyone to mute themselves? I think we're getting some conversations in the background. Thank you. Sorry, Bob.
No problem. So our recommendations are, at this point, let's start down the road and develop what we would call an initial allocation based on those numbers that I started with. And that's going to initiate the process. I think you can structure your decision so that you're going to revisit it in a couple of years, or make sure that it's understood that there are other factors that we haven't addressed yet, but this will at least get us through the initial couple of years of transitional pumping, and structure the initial allocation formula and the eligibility around basically acreage and status, whether it's permanent, annual, dairy, fallow, wetlands, barren, whatever. And then the board will have to make some decisions on what types of land are eligible for the allocation. Then once those decisions are made, then you can make further refinements on the formula after 2023, when we know more about whether there are shallow or deep wells on this property, whether we know, what the historic, the long-term historic water use has been on that parcel, all those sorts of things. But we can address those later, and still not like totally revamp and gut the original formula. These will be additions onto it and refinements to the formula, as opposed to just a complete recalculation. So we think the board needs to make some initial decisions for us to come up with the formula. I've got a couple of spreadsheets already on ways that this could happen, so I've kind of thought through it enough that when we get to the point of a board decision, we can give some examples of how those decisions would percolate through on the formula. But the first decision really relates to, are you gonna make all parcels eligible for an allocation, whether they're producing or non-producing, federal, fallow, all of that, or are you only going to make that sustainable yield available to a subset of those parcels? The second one relates to the transitional yield. Again, is that going to go to all parcels, or only to producing agricultural parcels, or only producing agricultural parcels and some other wild card land status that we learn about through the allocation registry. If you do sort of limit your transitional yield to currently producing agricultural parcels, I think you should also think about whether you want to further manage that allocation so that those producing parcels are receiving transitional yield that's proportional to either their historic water use or the land type. Do you want to ensure that permanent crops are getting a higher proportion of the transitional yield because they have less flexibility in how they crop their land compared to annual crops, or dairies. So that's the third decision. And then the fourth one is whether you want to allow landowners that have multiple parcels in the same subbasin. I'm qualifying that as same subbasin for now. That could be something that we start to talk about later when we talk about east and western Tri-County service areas. But it is the policy that all landowners or any landowner with multiple parcels can use their allocation on any parcel without limitation, as long as they don't exceed their total. So I think if we had some formal decisions from the board on these basic eligibility requirements, and I don't think you have to make those decisions until after we have the registry, so we see what sort of what the scope and sort of spectrum of our landowner base is. But once you do that, then we can plug in some formulas into a spreadsheet, and whether it's a spreadsheet or whether it's linked to the Four Creeks information system, that's still a decision that needs to be made. But fundamentally, we're trying to build a spreadsheet that has every parcel in it, has every landowner in it, and has their sustainable allocation, their transitional allocation, and then a whole bunch of formulas in the background that are supporting it based on the information that's in the registry. And I think that I put this together last night kind of quickly, so I don't have a closing slide, but this is where I'm going to stop. And I know that's a lot of information, and I apologize for that. But you know, this isn't. This is a multivariable problem, and because we want transparency and consistency between all 208 landowners in the GSA, I think it's important that we have all of these issues out on the table, and then you and the board can kind of make some decisions on how you want to work through everything.
So let me add two things very quickly to what Bob said. I just want to clarify one item. The 2035 date, you know, we talk about the ramp down period, and Bob talks about it ending in 2035. And some of you might be wondering why we use 2035 as opposed to 2040, which is the date that Sigma gives for sustainable or achieving sustainability. And the 2035 date was what was in the GSP. So for this initial cut of this document, we decided we were going to stick with the value in the year that was in the GSP. So I just wanted to clarify that. And obviously, if you look at it in an additional 5-year period, you know, the ramp down's not nearly as steep. So that's something to
Well,
consider.
there's actually a reference in the GSP to 2030 as well. So, you know, on one hand, the fact that these numbers bounce around, I think, is giving you some latitude in terms of, you know, picking the higher number and the longer number until we have some reason to change it. At this point, I think you want to be defensible and flexible. So we don't want to come up with something that's completely crazy because, you know, or is totally inconsistent with what's in your GSP. But given that there's some discrepancy here, I think we've tried to be generous to the landowners to try and stay on a somewhat even keel here for the next couple of years while we work out how to do this and see more data and information on what's going on.
The other item, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, go ahead, Mayor, if you want to finish there.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the other item that I wanted to clarify is you probably didn't see any discussion in this document about enforcement, and that's still an ongoing discussion as well. You know, if we have an allocation, how do we ensure that landowner X is meeting that you know, that allocation? And we did have some, you know, the one thing we know we're measuring, at least as far as Land IQ is concerned, is consumptive use. And we are not, and I repeat, not inclined to use consumptive use as the enforcement tool. So, you know, as we start talking about meters and other things, keep all of that in mind, is because ultimately, whatever method we decide to measure groundwater extraction at is going to have to be what part of our enforcement activity as well. So lots of decisions still to be made here, but at least I think this gives everybody a good just starting point for discussion. And I'm sorry, I cut somebody off. I wasn't sure who that was asking the question.
I mean, I had a question for Bob. It's Mike Nordstrom. On that section 2.2 on page 17, at the end of that first paragraph, you're talking about you're recommending initial ramp down for the eastern area. And then you start off by saying in number 1, the current pumping rate's 90,000. But then when you, at the last paragraph in that section, it's talking about a total allocation of 80,000 acre feet. I think the 90,000 includes both the Kings and the eastern, doesn't it? So
No.
I'm trying to, you know, make sure I understand, because the sustainable pumping rate that you're talking about, the 21,000, is just for the eastern, and that's based on the 80,000 acre feet, because you talk about it on the last paragraph in that section. But we're kind of, I'm trying to keep straight.
Right. No, the 20,000 number is completely independent of either the 80 or the 90,000 number. So that's strictly from the Tule Basin Coordination Agreement, which only affects half of the Tri-County Water Agency GSA. And the 90,000 is based on both the 90,000 that was submitted in the annual report by Harder and the 90,000 that I calculated using Cropscape were based on the crop distribution and irrigation requirements only in the eastern Tri-County.
But your last paragraph in there talks about using these ramp down parameters in the eastern. You're saying 21,000 plus 59,000 transitional for a total allocation of 80,000.
Of 80, right. So that represents the 90 is
surface water.
No. The 90,000 is the current pumping, and the 80,000 is, that's probably needs some clarification both in the slide and maybe the document. But the GSP commits to 10,000 acre feet per year reduction per year. I think is the way it's actually stated, and so that's where for this first allocation period, the initial reduction in pumping is 10,000 acre feet going to 80,000.
Okay.
And so why we think that's flex that, so because we don't know exactly what you're pumping now, this 90,000 ramping down to 80,000 is not a huge, it's kind of in our measurement error right now. So targeting 80,000 for the first segment of ramp down in the first allocation, I don't think it's a real huge cut because we really don't know what you're pumping now yet anyway.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, and I guess to follow on that, I don't have a problem with that, but are we prejudicing ourselves by putting the 21,000 out there now because of our, Angela's prescriptive claim and all that? Because I think that goes against the entire sub-basin, not just against, the folks in our GSA. So I think, I'm a little bit nervous about doing that when, if we end up in a fight on this thing, it'll be against an allocation on the entire basin, not just, our folks around the table there.
Well, I don't know that I can answer that question. I mean, that's the number that's currently in your plan. What the sort of political process is for prejudicing or contesting that yield within the sub-basin and then bringing it back to the individual GSA. I don't think that's not going to help us generate an allocation formula.
Hey, Bob, on this allocation formula though, do we or have you had a discussion with Harder on his new model and how they arbitrarily put a boundary in on the below ground flow to reduce our allocation? Because we need to have an understanding of why that occurred, because if you look at historical information, and you may want to talk to Ken Schmidt, that water flowed into the lake historically. So why do they artificially stick a boundary in and then reduce our water allocation for the eastern side? And I'm asking if you have an understanding on that, and if we've walked through their model, because I don't buy it and I don't agree with it.
No, we haven't walked through the new model at all. And at this point, I'm trying to avoid getting in the middle of the modeling war, because it's already shaping up to be a war that, I think we should follow it more closely now. What's been submitted to DWR has been submitted to DWR, and now that we're on board with you, I think we're going to be paying more attention to how this model is being used on a number of different fronts. But ultimately, it's if the sustainable yield changes for some reason in the new model, we'll be digging deeper into why that is and asking some questions that maybe should have been asked when the model was developed originally. And that issue of the boundary flow may be something you can handle with a separate agreement. And let the basin do their thing on multiple iterations with the model and looking at the subsidence along the canal. But ultimately, maybe there's a water balance agreement that you can achieve at the boundary that would be acceptable and really not affect the compliance with Sigma at the basin scale.
Yeah, we have to, at some point, and I'd be glad to be with you, but we have to sit down with Harder and understand how they are arbitrarily creating below ground boundaries. At the same time, Harder's putting together a model, and we don't have any actual data on the amount of water that leaves the Creighton Preserve and where's it going. It's not in any plans.
Right.
We need to know. We need to know what those numbers are. So
Well,
I have no problem sitting down.
I can tell you.
We
I can
gotta
tell you.
know this. How do you do a model like this?
Right. I can tell you that
It's a very big well field.
I do know how they set up their boundaries. They just used what's called a constant head boundary, and that approach to configuring the model is different than what the Tulare Lake modeler used, which was called a general head boundary that extended outside of the jurisdictional boundary of the Tulare Lake Basin. As a modeler, I think the approach that the Tulare Lake modeler took was better than just putting in a constant head boundary. But that's the kind of boundary resolution that I think is needed. And if I'm not going too far out of the lines here, I do have some ideas on kind of a third party way to try and resolve that. Because dueling models tend to anchor in both sides of the modeling question. So Harder's always going to be on the defensive that, this is the best way to do it. I've been modeling for years and this is how we do it. And you get Dave Bean on the other side saying, no, this is a better way to do it. It's the way I've always done it. But the fact of the matter is, they have both established an artificial boundary in the model that doesn't exist in nature. So one thing that DWR actually has the upper hand on all of us in this is with what's called their C2VSIM model. And this is a model that covers this exact same area, and it does not have a general head boundary or a constant head boundary or any sort of artificial numerical construct on that baundary between the two GSAs. It's totally looking at the regional recharge discharge relationships of the whole lower basin. And I think some exploration into what that model is saying, and they've upgraded it. They've made what's called a fine grid version of it. It's much better than the original one that was done back in the mid 2000s. And in fact, Amir and I have been in contact with one of the developers of the model. He's out in private practice now to get his impressions on how the model is performing, and he also agrees that it's much better. So that could be a kind of a third-party tool to avoid these two modelers getting so defensive about how they set up the boundary. And
yeah, I'm just thinking, it's just a the district directed harder, but this person that you know, or the group that's modeled on the overall plan, is he a hydrologist that you know?
Yeah, yeah, he's an excellent hydrologist. He actually developed the code, so he knows all the ins and outs of how it works. But the fundamental problem with virtually all of the models in this lower basin are that they've got artificial boundaries on them, and those boundaries are hugely important to the water balance. And as soon as you change those boundaries, or if there are discrepancies from one basin to the other, both water balances are meaningless. And so I really think that some way to take those boundaries out of the equation is going to be needed to resolve a lot of these issues, not just this one.
Mark, I know that there's a number of questions about the model, and we've had some meetings that Deanna's been on with Harder, and we've received some data. In fact, we've also point blank have asked some questions about how other well fields are being handled. They're being handled similarly to the way the Angiola well field's being handled. But the model, unfortunately, is what we have to kind of go with. So as we start these allocation discussions, I'm going to ask you to maybe, if we can kind of focus in on some of the methodology that we've presented this morning, and maybe I want to open this up for everybody to ask some questions, or again, I'm going to repeat that there's going to be lots of other opportunities to have discussions on this. But if there's initial thoughts that people have as we're on what we've presented today, and Mark and Mike, I would like to continue that conversation maybe a little bit offline with the two of you.
Okay.
I have some follow-up questions.
Go ahead. Good.
So, Mayor Bob, I'm not sure which one of you guys wants to answer this, but in the strawman document, you talk about a ramp down on a linear basis. Can you elaborate on that? Because we had discussed a stair-step method or approach, and you guys are talking about a linear, so I'm just trying to understand what that is going to look like for the growers.
I think that was Mo. Is that you, Mo?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Mo, so we went back and forth on this one a little bit as well. Ultimately, we went back to kind of what the GSP said about the 10,000 acre feet reduction per year. What we're proposing in this initial draft is to keep it consistent for the first 4 years, the transitional pumping, and then start to step it down every 2 years after that by 10,000 until we hit the 21,000 sustainable yield by I think it actually hits it in 2034, I believe, if I got that right. But that's part of that discussion is twofold. Do you want more of a step down? First 5 years is one number, second 5 years, third 5 years, and that's a question for the group. And the second question I have for the group is, do we keep it at the 2035, or do we give ourselves a little bit more flexibility? There is some pros and cons to both methods. Obviously, from a grower standpoint, you'd like some more flexibility and a little bit more time. Our concern from a GSA standpoint, and I'm putting words in Deanna's mouth, so Deanna, pipe up if you feel I'm overstepping here, but we also have some concerns about how the neighbors are going to perceive our sustainable efforts, and how our efforts to achieve sustainability. And we're already, as you've seen in some of the comments we received on the GSP, several of our neighboring GSAs are feeling that the Tri-County is not taking sufficient steps, and that the pumping going on in Tri-County is causing other problems across the subbasin. So keeping all of that in mind, that was part of our thinking as we kind of did this more linear ramp down over Mo, where it's a step down every 2 years as opposed to every 5 years.
So when you say 10,000 acre feet, we still got to figure out what the allocation's going to be or what the gross acreage we're going to allocate over, correct?
That's right.
So
Right.
we're still at a point where we don't know as growers what we're going to have for the next 4 years or 5 years or 2 years.
Pretty sure, Mo, I think we're gonna go towards the irrigated acres that's where the allocation, for the transitional.
For transitional.
Right, that was the question they put out for us, but I think that's a decision we gotta make pretty quickly, but I think the ground that's been irrigated will get the transitional pumping credit.
But then how are you going to handle the Angiola issue with the prescriptive right over
So
all the fallow ground?
we kind of put that to the side. We just put that to the side right now.
Okay.
But I guess then, Steve, I have to ask for Angiola though, how many irrigated acres do we have that are gonna get allocated?
Which would be 33,000. Well, I think we'd have to go back.
That's outside the basin though, Mark.
Yeah, so whatever's.
How are you?
I think you go back to how, looking at sustainable yield, you got the two pieces they put out there, Bob, Murphy out, you got the sustainable yield question, what that number is. So there's this transitional area. With the transitional will be decision whether we give it to currently irrigated land or not, right?
Well, but that's the question I'm asking though, Steve, for Angiola, if you're not talking about any irrigated acres across the sub-basin, then what's Angiola's allocation going to be if you're going to do it that way?
Right, and that's why we have these are the questions out there.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, so my second question then is you also talked about the expiration for carryover. So what period of time what's reasonable for a carryover?
About for the water.
I think that,
Yeah.
that, again, I don't think that's a decision you need to make right now. I think it depends in part how you plan to design your infiltration facilities, what we learn about the upper versus the lower aquifer. I've seen anywhere from 2 to 10 year expiration dates on artificial recharge projects. I've seen a combination of not just expiration, but kind of declining percentages over time, so that you only get credit for a declining percentage of what you put in if you try and take it out later. But so that's something that needs to get factored in once you have some surface water infiltration projects that we can look at and understand what makes sense.
But realistically, our area is not good for infiltration, and I think Ken Smith's pretty much established that. When you get, east of 43, you might have some infiltration, but in the west of 83, in that whole area, there is no infiltration. So I guess I don't mean to get frustrated with you guys, but as a grower, I'm going, okay, how do we plan for this thing, right? If we go buy water now and we start using water instead of pumping, are we getting the credits, or do we just all wait till the last minute and, try to figure out what the hell to do?
You gotta get the credits. We gotta figure out what they are.
So
that's my point. How do we get there if we can't even figure out how to allocate? Right, so if we go with the producing acres, Angiola is going to take us to court.
You can't do it. Every acre is going to have to get an allocation. That's how
You want to address that, Dan?
Okay, so, all right, so at my direction, I had Bob and Amir separate out Angiola from this allocation process. Angiola has informed Tri-County Water Authority that it believes it has a historical prescriptive right to pump an unknown amount, let's say an unknown amount at this time, but they have a historical prescriptive right that they believe can be perfected and that they are going to protect, right? So if you look at what is sustainable yield in the coordination agreement, there's no way to allocate the prescriptive right to that. It doesn't work. So for the allocation process currently that we're working through in this document, it is strictly for the southeast area of Thule. It is allocating, it gives us a sustainable yield with what is allocated in the coordination agreement for that area. And the Angola question is going to have to be answered over time, and it is, again, a historical prescriptive right is not against a GSA or an area, and so that's something that's going to have to be worked through separately.
Again, bear with me, in the real world, so the GSA says, okay, now we're gonna allocate over irrigated lands, right? The very next day, Mike over here is gonna go to court and file a lawsuit going, you can't do that because you're taking away our prescriptive right. And now we're nowhere. And as growers, we're still stuck in the middle.
Again, the allocation that we're talking about and the number that we're talking about is the southeast area only.
Okay. I didn't look at it that way, Dan. I looked at the sustainable yield for the Thule Basin, which would include the north portion too. We're looking at the Thule Basin as a safe, because we're part of this coordination agreement, we kind of got our hands tied a little bit by how we put ourselves out on the GSP and the coordination agreement. So we're not just, we're tied in with, a few other districts to the east of us. So, the sustainable yield, from what I understand what Bob and Amir are presenting, is for the whole Tri-County Thule Basin, is the safe yield at that 0.34.
That's the numbers that are in here, yeah.
That's what we're talking about for the whole, which you would apply that over the whole Thule Basin.
Yeah, but I would like that number is not correct.
Well, yeah, I agree with you too, but that's the number we got to start with. We had to start with something, and that's the number that's out there. That's the department has a number, the Thule Basin has a number, so we had to start with something.
Okay, so I started with that same assumption until we all started having this conversation, and then I kind of got lost because if we're starting with 0.34, that means we're taking the allocation, we're dividing it over the total acres.
And that's what we're proposing. That's just nothing that's been decided. We're just put it out there for discussion.
But total acres, you're in total acres in the sub-basin, but that really hurts Angiola. And that's, I guess, Deanna, where I come back. How far are we gonna keep kicking the can down the road before this is gonna come to a head? If we're not gonna be able to resolve it, then, when do somebody pull the trigger to say somebody else in a black robe's gonna have to decide this? But we can kick it down the road, for another couple years or so, but at some point.
And as growers, we're still stuck in the middle, because we're going, oh, well, what are they gonna do, and what's the GSA gonna decide? And I can't go out and buy water and start using it because I got no legitimate way of going, okay, I brought in 10,000 acre feet or XYZ. And
that's why I made the comment earlier, because I don't think it's just our GSA issue, it's against the whole sub-basin.
Right.
So that's why we left it off, honestly, Mike. We took it off the allocation discussion today, because it is, I agree with you, what you just said. It is.
Yeah, prescriptive right cannot be against just the GSA.
No, it's the sub-basin.
It's a sub-basin issue.
It's the regional issue, really, when you think about it. Not just sub-basin, it'll be intra-basin.
It is regional.
I just don't wanna get where we start doing this and all of a sudden we're prejudiced Angelo, why'd you guys decide here and went along with this?
And I'm actually one step down the road from you. I'm saying, let's file the damn lawsuit and let's get it over with so we all know, right? Because otherwise we're all stuck, right? You can't move one way or the other, and the GSA can keep making rules, but if we all know that we're going to end up in court, then why are we wasting everybody's time?
Yeah, unless the whole sub-basin can come together and compromise.
Right.
Makes sense for everyone.
And that's why I want to have that discussion with their hydrologist and Bob, and we can talk about these arbitrary boundaries and get this number up. That 21,000 is not correct, it's too low.
So I apologize for getting us off track, but, you know, those are some of the issues that we face on
No,
the
that's-
management side.
That's perfectly understandable, and we racked our brains trying to figure out a way to thread the needle, and there's really no way to do that just yet. You know, and Tri-County has a certain jurisdiction, and the basin is you know, a group of jurisdictions that has its own process, and then you got these basin boundaries with Sigma requirements that you can affect, you know, the next basin sustainability. So a lot of these things are kind of above the pay grade of Tri-County on its own, and whether that gets resolved through a basin-to-basin agreement or a Tri-County to El Rico agreement, or, you know, who knows? There could be some other ways to do this without turning it into a massive multi-GSA food fight.
Okay, again, I apologize, so we can keep going.
Amir, I have a couple questions on the policy.
Sure.
If I heard you right, you said that we are not inclined to use consumptive use as an enforcement tool, and the sustainable yield is presented in headgate, not ET. So based on both of those, I'm to understand that the ET values that the GSA is getting per parcel are not going to be used against a landowner's allocation to determine how sustainable they are and where they're at?
We would need to get some more data from Land IQ and see how that data starts to compare against your, you know, the meter data that you're reporting. The initial gut check was that if we're going to use consumptive use as the enforcement, then rather than giving you an allocation in extraction, in acre feet of extraction, I almost should give you allocation in consumptive use, right? So that it wasn't, and all of these things are open to discussion. Our initial gut check was we're not inclined to use the consumptive use. If I turn out, you know, if we're having this conversation 3 months from now and I may have changed my mind, I'll be honest with you, I'm open to discussion. I'm just trying to figure out if what we're measuring is the same, and, you know, how we're allocating and what we're measuring should be the same. Does that make sense? Did I say that right?
I mean, I think you're going to have a management enforcement system that is going to have to be somewhat adaptive, and you're going to have to take as much information as you can gather on any one year, and that includes groundwater levels, that includes pumping, that includes consumptive use, that includes how much surface water was brought in, and you're going to have to sort of make some adjustments and some year-to-year calls based on that information. But you're setting some long-term targets and some baseline allocation trajectories, you know, based on the information that you have right now, which is primarily ET related. So I think that's partly also just a management decision, management style for the GSA. Do you just want to have one number that you manage to year after year after year, or do you want to look at information year by year and sort of make some accommodations based on the past and what you think the immediate future is going to look like?
That all makes sense, and thank you for the answer. I'm just trying to figure out why landowners are paying 73 cents an acre for something that apparently isn't going to be used.
The Land IQ data you're asking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're going to use meters to enforce an allocation policy, as you've said, and you're going to use the headgate demand or the not the consumptive use sustainable yield, if you're going to use the meter data that's being self-reported twice a year for those things, then you're not actually aligning with the subbasin on use calculation, because they all use in their allocation ET.
Right. Right. And so, I think as we've said several times today, that's an ongoing discussion. In fact, we have a call with Four Creeks on Monday to talk literally about this very issue and try to sort this issue out. But yes, Stacy Ann, this is one of those things that we've got to work out, and this is why this is a working draft document. And if as stakeholders, if you have a preference or if you would like us to, the GSA to have one method or the other, please let us know, and we'd like to hear from you guys on that.
I appreciate the complexity of the issue, and I'm just trying to gain a broad understanding of kind of what you're planning to do. So thank you.
There's a lot of variables. Jeff, you turned on your video. Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the having meters in Tri-County makes a lot of sense because of the different water stratas that you have and knowing where that water's coming out of. But for purposes of this particular allocation, you've already said you don't have enough data to differentiate between the various depths. And I think you just make it a lot more complicated having a different measuring system than everybody else in your subbasin. So, land IQs gives you consistent data. It's got a fairly high level of confidence given its age, and it's what the rest of the Tule subbasin is using. So I don't know why you wouldn't use it initially, and then as you start tracking and collecting actual meter data, let that inform your confidence in the land IQ data. But to me, this is not a complicated decision.
I think what I was trying to say, and I probably have said this poorly, but it wasn't relying on just the consumptive use. You're going to have to take that consumptive use value and then do the calculation to get to the groundwater extracted. And the groundwater extraction calculation is going to involve, the type of crop it is and your cropping, your irrigation efficiencies, and a number of other calculations or factors that would be part of that calculation. And as long as everyone is comfortable with the values that the rest of the subbasin has decided, and Harder in fact did this for the annual report, they basically said if you have pistachios, then the efficiencies were X, and the some of these values were already in their system. And if everyone's okay with that, then we certainly will consider that. But my point was we weren't going to use just the consumptive use data to enforce by itself. It would have to go through that calculation, and everyone would have to be comfortable with those factors that are being applied to their field.
Yeah, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but when you get the land IQ data, the data that I've seen from them, you back out you got the raw data, you back out precip and surface deliveries, and irrigation efficiency is really a calculation after the fact. I mean, it doesn't really enter in to the calculation of consumption.
Not the consumptive use, but,
right.
But the groundwater.
So if your allocation is based on consumptive use, and your measuring is based on consumptive use, you got a match there.
Right.
The rest of that stuff is interesting. It's important.
Right.
But it isn't necessarily relevant for your allocation.
Right.
Process.
Yeah, and I think that's what I said earlier is if I'm going to give you, if we're going to measure in consumptive use, then we should allocate in consumptive use. Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, Jeff. I think we're saying the same thing. But yes, we may end up using the land IQ data. But if we do, we're going to have to make sure that what we're measuring is how we're allocating in the same units.
Well, and that's also the reason for trying to true this up through the landowner registry. If this group thinks that the calculation I made based on cropscape is incorrect, and that you'd rather use the irrigated acreage that's shown in the land IQ, we can do that, and then you're just starting from a lower number.
Yeah. Okay, so we're actually a little bit over our call already, and I know that I told everybody we'd be done by 11:30, but if you guys can bear with me, this is an ongoing discussion. I've said that several times. You've barely had enough time or any time to look at this document. I would encourage everyone to look at the document and start to come back to us with your thoughts, comments to us, to Deanna, obviously, and your concerns, suggestions, whatever you want to call it. And we want to continue to have more dialogue with the stakeholders. We want to get we really want to get your input. Nothing is set in stone. We would consider any modifications, and we're happy to look at, get your thoughts and everything. So please encourage everyone to do that. Our next meeting is also going to be a lot of discussion on this very topic. Don't feel like you have to wait till the next meeting to have that discussion. You're more than welcome to call us and talk to us individually. But yeah, the next meeting, and then the thought is, we're going to do an initial presentation to the board, and then we're hoping by the November board meeting, we start to get some board decisions on how they would like us to proceed on some of the questions that Bob had for them and decision points that they have for them. And then we can start to move forward. I understand, there's still, there's still the Angiola issue out there. And as now that this document's out, this draft document is out, we can continue to have some more dialogue on some of those issues as well. So let me take a quick 5 minutes at the very end here. We've talked about allocation and trying to ramp down to a number, but part of the GSA's process also is to look at bringing in new water supply. And I want to take just a moment quickly to look at some of the options for bringing in some surface water into the area. These are not all the options. These are just some of the initial ones that we've looked at. And like I said, bear with me. Might be a little bit slow on how this works. Okay. Bob, I'm assuming everybody can see the screen. It works okay? All right. So quickly, just some ideas that we've looked at, 4 quick alternatives. Essentially coming in with some Kings River floodwater in the years that we do have floodwater available to us, taking that water through the headworks and then down the Blakely Canal to a still to be built Liberty project. We would park it there until the demand comes in. We then move it down the South Canal through lateral B. And Mark, if I get any of this wrong, I'm sure you'll correct me. You know the system much better than I do, but we move it eastwards on lateral B, connect to the Alpa main canal, and move down into the southeast area. Obviously, there's distribution systems and everything else that would have to be built out to get water appropriately into the southeast area. But at least if we've got water coming down the Alpa main canal, that's alternative one. Obviously, there's a number of challenges. We've got to build the Liberty project. We've got to get permission here from Alpa to use their main canal. And there's, I'm sure, going to be some tolling agreements that need to be in place. And then there's also the issue of potentially water leaving the Kings River service area, which, all of these are things that we can overcome, but that's essentially alternative one. You'll notice on all of these, I left the cost out. As those are still items that need to be figured out on the exact size and what that cost of that water is going to be.
Maybe, Bob, before you leave that one,
yeah.
a couple things. the source wouldn't just be Kings, you could potentially have Kauai and Tule water. And there might be times where you get water off the aqueduct as well.
Right.
And then on the Alpha deal, I mean, push come to shove, we had the whole CAS legislation, so if we had to wheel through their system, we could force that as long as there's available capacity on it. And then even water leaving the Kings service area, there's also a floodwater agreement on the Kings that you're one of the member units and you're taking water through your system, you have first priority of that water that would be leaving the service area anyway. You could, I think we could work through that.
Yeah, I think all of these are issues that we can resolve. It's just a matter of selecting which of these alternatives might be the best one for the southeast growers.
Well, the best one actually, the easiest one is to take the Kings River down the Wilbur there to the Liberty Project, and then and then transfer water via an exchange with other growers through the Holman Canal to Poso, and that'd be the fastest.
Yeah. So
gravity almost all the way over.
Gravity all the way over.
Yeah.
So, but you want with the the real availability of area in a canal is through the Wilbur, not the Blakely.
Okay. So the
South Fork to the Kings, down the Tule to the Wilbur.
right. So replace Blakely in all of these. As I said, these are all conceptual ideas at this point. So let's say we take it down the Wilbur here to Liberty, and then again we move it from the South Canal to the Homeland, and then over to Poso, and then use the Poso to move it over to the southeast area.
You'd actually take it, if we're going to Outfall though, we take it down lateral A, which is Utica, all the way back. So it's a very simple. Yeah, it's very simple.
Okay, so lateral A, then and then back down the Homeland.
The Wilbur's very important because that's the reclamation district for the Liberty. It's in Reclamation 825. And it's all controlled by us. We manage, Angela Water District manages the Wilbur.
Okay.
So you want to go right through the Wilbur District.
Okay.
I think just showing the project there, the conveyance.
It's a very ass-kicking project. It's very awesome, and it's not only doable. It already has all of the conveyance systems are there.
Yeah.
Getting water to it's not the issue. It's when we're using the water out of it, conveying out, where we may have some challenges.
Right. So in both cases, there are some, as long as we get it into the Poso, in Mark's right, there's different ways to move it. There's lots of interconnectedness here on the conveyance system. But the idea here is, once you get into Homeland, you've got to get some agreement with the Boswell, and then there are some repairs to the Poso that would have to be done in order to get it out to the southeast area. So that's, some variation of this is option 2, get into the Liberty and then move it out to the Poso. The nice thing again is a lot of these conveyance systems exist. The third one that we looked at is if you take Deer Creek and you've got floodwater on Deer Creek, we can park that floodwater on Deer Creek here at the Nunez and the White Ranch wetland reserves. And then as we need that floodwater, we can move it down Homeland and again out to the Alpha and out to the southeast area. As you guys are all well aware, in those flood years, we've got a lot of water coming in a very small amount of time. So the ability to park it somewhere, especially in the wetland reserves, does give us a nice place to park that water. The wetland reserves do come with some other restrictions on how quickly we can take the water out and how, the kind of timelines that we can move the water out. So it's not perfect. It's not privately controlled like Liberty, but but it does give us a place to park some of the Deer Creek floodwater. And again, we have some of the same issues, again, on Homeland and the main canal here. And then finally, the fourth item that we looked at, or the fourth alternative, is the allocation that Angiola has on Deer Creek. And if you were to just take that, and rather than park that, you take it straight, where Deer Creek runs into Homeland, and take that down Homeland and out to the southeast area as well. So multiple different sources of water. At least three of those alternatives, certainly rely on flood water, which you might be looking at maybe every 4 years or so. The canal systems are in place. At least the conveyance systems are in place to move a lot of the water. You would have to build, if you use Liberty, you have to build some type of, agree on what that project is going to look like. If you build, and then you'd have to have some kind of conveyance system once it's in the southeast area. For any of these options to work, we would definitely want to get some kind of support from the southeast growers, and kind of have you help us decide which one of these alternatives you'd like us to pursue, if any. And if there's other ideas out there, we're happy to look at all of those. But the idea here is I want to leave with the southeast growers, at least, and the stakeholders, is that we are looking at different alternatives to try and bring some water into the area. I know the concern, of course, is going to be a cost per acre foot of that water. But if we start to get some ideas on what you're thinking, we can start to do some conceptual cost analysis on some of these options. Keeping in mind with what the discussion we just had, if we're going to ramp down over that time period, do any of these types of projects pencil out cost-wise for you? And that's what we're kind of hoping to get some feedback and some ideas, or if you'd like to see some variation on some of those projects, we're happy to have that discussion as well. Questions or comments? Concerns? Quiet group today.
It didn't seem that quiet earlier.
All right, Deanna, anything you want to add at the end? We're going to wrap up. I know we're quite a bit over, and we'll go ahead and wrap up.
1,000 acres Mark has listed.
No, I just, the southeast area, we're trying to look at anything we can do to get water to that area. It truly is something that's on our minds, and we want to work with the growers to help them in any way we can. It's a tough discussion. I'm hopeful that eventually we'll get to a place within the sub-basin where we can possibly recharge upstream someplace in a different GSA and pull those credits out downstream. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get there, but I'm hopeful that will happen, and that would be another option in the future. But those discussions really haven't happened yet. I think they will begin to happen, but that they really haven't happened yet. But it probably wouldn't be a 1-for-1, but when we go back to the artificial boundaries underground, we all know that the water, once it's recharged, it does flow towards the southeast direction or towards the lake bottom. So recharging upstream makes a lot more sense than trying to possibly inject the water out here or do something like that. So I'm hopeful that our neighbors will work with us in the future when we're thinking about how to supplement the southeast area. But those are just some options we're working on. And again, I hope that you will read through the documents we put out today and provide comment. The board is going to adopt, I believe, that they're going to consider it and most possibly adopt the metering policy. To Stacey Ann's point, and I know that we are paying a heavy expense to Land IQ, and Jeff's point. It is what the entire Tule subbasin is using for their calculation, and at this point, I don't see not using that calculation unless we find out through our metering policy and through data as we look through it that it's not equal or it's not the same. It's going to be important to know what our actual numbers are for the growers as well as for sustainability moving forward. So we want to have the best data possible. The idea that we may just use the consumptive use number in the allocation is not off the table. That's most probable that's what we're going to use, but still the data is so new and so fresh. We haven't had an opportunity to really dig in to see what the differences are and evaluate it. So it's an initial discussion, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, in the next few months. In order to be on the level of the rest of the subbasin, we're going to have to get an allocation and get moving. When your neighbors are already allocating and their growers are feeling that pinch, and for us to just banter about it for the next 5 years, it's not going to work at the subbasin level. So that's why we're pushing through. For some, it may seem too slow, and for others, it may seem too fast. But that's what we're doing. So again, I appreciate everybody joining us today. Sometimes these meetings can be a little technical and a little long, but they're important, and it's something we're going to have to work with, and numbers that we eventually will have to live with as we move forward. So anyway, again, I thank everybody. And Amira, did you have anything else?
No, I was just going to say our next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, September 23rd at 10 a.m. And we'll send out make sure that everybody has that on their calendar as well. But yeah, that was it for me, Deanna.
Is that the 23rd?
Yeah, the 23rd.
Yeah, 23rd.
Yeah, the fourth Wednesday of the month.
Yes.
And that's at 10 as well. And you'll get a meeting invite as well for that. Okay, this was a long meeting.
I thought we had some of this. I think we'll have many more long ones to come, Amir.
Yes, I think so. In that case,
Be ready.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We'll talk, and please reach out to us if you have any questions. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Later.